And now, aviation weather around Alaska. Midweek greetings. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook that'll take us into Thursday and Friday leading up to the weekend. And a lot of things are going to be happening. We've had some very cold air settle in across much of the mainland, especially the interior along the west and southwest side of the state. It's been stormy, very heavy snowfall again in areas of northern parts of the Panhandle earlier this week. Little break, still some lingering light rain and snow around areas of the Panhandle here, but that's going to be picking up again. Another push of moisture. A low is going to lift out of the North Pacific up toward the Western Gulf, and that's going to pull a front and more moisture along with breezy conditions across the Panhandle here Friday into Saturday. And that system also could spread significant snow along areas of Prince William Sound, eastern Kenai, maybe even pulling back toward the Anchorage Bowl later this weekend. So stay tuned to later forecasts because the forecast is a little more uncertain as to how far west that moisture will be able to pull back. Meanwhile, even colder air is going to begin to funnel southward. We're going to see some very cold air settle in here through the interior, also down along the west side of the state, eastern Bering, and then swinging across the eastern Aleutians and across the Alaska Peninsula by this weekend. As a couple of storms, there'll be yet another moist storm come up out of the North Pacific and head back toward Prince William Sound early in the week on Monday that could reinforce some heavy snowfall in areas of south central Alaska. So those of you all along this area, especially along south of the Alaska Range and in through the Panhandle, going to have an active weather pattern coming up. In areas along the west coast, cold temperatures with brisk winds. We expect some pockets of IFR, areas of the North Slope and along the Brooks Range Thursday morning, areas of IFR within the Panhandle. And then as we go through Thursday afternoon, still IFR conditions, especially toward Wrangell, Ketchikan, Metlakatla, on up toward Juneau and all the way up toward the Canadian border passes there. And generally MVFR conditions, North Slope, Arctic coast, perhaps a pocket of IFR out there as you get north of Point Hope. But otherwise, looking at IFR conditions increasing across the Panhandle Friday morning as that moisture surge begins to come up along the Panhandle and the Gulf Coast. And by the time we get into Friday afternoon, we see increasing moisture here across the lower Gulf in through the Panhandle with IFR conditions becoming more widespread. Northern Panhandle will initially see another round of some accumulating snow on top of already a very heavy snowpack, but unfortunately, heavier rainfall could then come on top of that heavy snowpack as we go through the later weekend and early next week. And again, as I mentioned, this area here going to get blasted around the mountains around the eastern Kenai, Prince William Sound, especially inland Thompson Pass, going to get blasted with heavy snow, even blizzard conditions, and also that heavy snow up through the Copper River Basin. Coastal areas will likely change to a cold, wind-driven rain. So again, be aware. And then on the backside of this storm, we expect brisk north-northwest winds across the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians pulling down yet some of the coldest air of the season. Anatuvik Pass here on Thursday, we'll see MVFR conditions. Adigan Pass also MVFR conditions. Further south and west along the Alaska Range, we generally anticipate VFR conditions. Lake Clark, Merrill, all the way rounding up through rainy and windy passes. Now as you go further north up on the other side of the Alaska Range, up the Tanana, Yukon rivers, you will likely encounter some MVFR conditions, especially in the morning. There could be some areas of freezing fog as a result of just the very stable conditions with a ridge of high pressure continuing to hold at least through the end of the week. Isabel Pass VFR, VFR Mentasta, and then Tanita Pass VFR conditions expected for Thursday. Further south, Portage Pass VFR, but we do anticipate IFR conditions to hold there in the northern Panhandle at Chilkoot and White, and then once we get into Friday, into the weekend, largely IFR conditions with snow likely in that location. So looking at the freezing levels Thursday morning, surface freezing line has pushed down into the lower Bering Sea north of the Aleutians, crossing the low end or tip there of the Alaska Peninsula up along the Gulf Coast and in through the inner channels here, southwest portion of the Panhandle. Freezing levels aloft do bump up a little bit to 4,000 feet along the central southern Panhandle. This will be increasing and pulling back toward the northwest. A little warmer air aloft will be associated with that low that lifts up toward the western Gulf on Friday and then over the course of the weekend, because we got a couple of systems going to do that. So the icing threat on Thursday, there are areas of lingering light rain and snow here in the Panhandle. We could still find some moderate icing there. Southern inner channels there of the Panhandle above 4,000 and 6,000 feet, especially as you get south of Ketchikan into Dixon Entrance. Jet stream pattern aloft, 30,000 feet. We have the hints of a trough here up in the northwest. This trough is going to dig southward. It's going to allow this very cold air to settle. There's some really cold Arctic air here along the North Slope Arctic coast. That's going to settle southward into the interior and work its way down along the southwest coast and eventually swing out across the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians. At 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, we see that troughiness, the colder air, especially as we get into Friday. Saturday is going to begin to settle southward as warm, moist air comes up from the North Pacific into the Gulf and Panhandle, especially these areas east of the Kenai Peninsula. So that's going to, the pivot point is where the storm will be situated here in the western Gulf, a couple of lows, I should say. 3,000-foot winds, well, we have some strong winds up there around Kaktovik toward the Mackenzie River in the far north, and then here along the Alaska Peninsula, extending out along and north of the Aleutians, a pretty broad area of 30, 40 knot easterly winds with stronger winds further south in the North Pacific. So the greatest threat of turbulence on Thursday up here in the far northeastern Arctic coast toward the Mackenzie River. There could be some moderate turbulence, especially surface to 4,000 feet. A pocket of isolated turbulence there, surface to 6,000 feet, south end of the Panhandle. But as we extend out along the Alaska Peninsula and especially into the Aleutians, we expect areas of moderate turbulence, surface to 3,000, surface to 4,000 feet. So be aware of that and stay tuned to later forecasts, because we do have a very active weather pattern coming up here across a good portion of the state, very stormy one here along the Gulf Coast, Panhandle, into south central areas this weekend into early next week.